and many, perhaps also counting our friends who will be watching through the web, receiving this light so that we all can change ourselves. This way, we elevate our minds and our hearts to those who may not be here with us today for whatever reason, that they may receive this environment in their hearts as well. We are thankful for this moment and we ask for your blessings, and so be it. So, before we pass the word to our dear friend Julio, I would like to formally introduce him. Many of us sometimes feel that, oh, is it necessary? It is necessary, right? Why is Julio talking about escape mechanism of the ego? What, how he came to this conclusion, we don't know yet, but at least we know that he have something to on his luggage, on his past, that kind of gives us a good foundation that he's not just going to be mumbling words. He's someone who works hard, study hard, just as many of us do in our daily lives, but professionally as well as what he really focused on his daily lives, right? So besides the good brother that we already know that have come here many times and many more times to come, hopefully, Julio Padovan is a Brazilian national, has been working as a full-time researcher of the Rockefeller University since 1996. And he is also an adjunct associate professor at the Department of Chemistry and Pharmaceutical Sciences at York College, CUNY, in New York City. He holds several academic degrees and he is a lecturer for both the physical sciences and the Spiritist doctrine. Introduced to Spiritism at the age of 15, Julio dedicates his time to translating Spirit's book from Portuguese and French into English and disseminating it through lectures. He is particularly interested in studying and explaining the solid logical foundation upon which Spiritist concepts are built, as well as in creating a strong association among those very same concepts. So, for those of us today that need some work with our ego, anybody here? Anyone who engage on the escape mechanism of life, right? Anyone here? Not really, right? Do we need Julio? Let's give him a chance, right, to talk once more, folks, about escape mechanism of the ego. Julio, thank you in advance for this moment, and the floors are yours. Thank you.
Well, good evening, brothers, brothers and sisters, all of you here from the physical realm, those of you at home or at work, and those of you, of course, our brothers and sisters of the greater spirituality. Today we have a very interesting topic, the escape mechanisms of the ego, and this lecture is entirely based on the books by Joana de Angelis as Spirit and Divaldo Franco as a psychographer, but particularly the book The Conscientious Being, Empty Lives, that comes to mind. It is going to be the full trilogy of Star Wars. We will start with drama. We will start with the war, because it's a war based on egos, or for conquering of the universe. We'll have the drama, the famous Luke, I'm your father. And then we are going to go back to the war, which is exactly what we have when we're talking about the ego. So this is an outline of the lecture right here. So it's 7 parts. Don't worry, it looks quite a lot there. But a lot of these things are animations. And I hope that I did an okay job, because this is very abstract. It's very hard. It's not like when you're talking about a tree and it can take a picture, or you're talking about a car, or even certain things can put a bill there and the bill disappears, on the screen. But this is very, very abstract, and it's kind of hard to sometimes follow it when someone is talking about it. So instead of having a lot of text on the screen, even when there is text, don't worry, because there will be an animation right afterwards. Okay, so just a heads up for all of you. Now, we'll start, like I always do this, I like to be very clear about what I'm going to talk about, and also what the meaning of the words are, because the meanings change from one context to another. So famous words, and more words. So let us have a quick idea. What I'm trying to convey here is that sometimes we have the same word that has different meanings. That's as simple as that. And one of them is the word ego. So we have the ego as a noun, the one in red all the way to the right. Okay? When we say, for instance, that person has such a huge ego, that has nothing to do with the ego we are going to talk about today. It has some correlation, but it's not the same thing. When Joanna de Angelis, for instance, speaks of ego, same thing for self, right? When she speaks of self, when she speaks of I, she contextualizes them in a psychoanalytical way, which is different than when we say that person has such an ego. Oh, I'm doing this to myself, for myself, the self that is on the right side, the pronoun. Okay? So I decided to make matters simpler, at least for us today, all right, to capitalize the first letter of each one of the words on the left. Okay? The words here on the left. They are going to be capitalized when I am giving what I now call the Angelesian meaning, Joanna de Angelis' meaning. Okay? And when I want to talk, when we are not going to talk about regular meaning, the meaning we have when we're chit-chatting with someone outside, I'm going to leave it as the grammar allows us with the lowercase. Of course, the only exception is the pronoun I, because in English it is capitalized. I cannot break the grammar rules. Right? I can add to it, but I cannot break the ones that are existing. So this is what I want you to understand, because there's going to be a set of words that you're going to see sometimes with lowercase and uppercase. I will try to be very clear about them, just in case if I'm not or I forget, I skip. Remember, everything that we want to give a psychoanalytical term or context to will be with the first letter capitalized, whether it starts the sentence or not. So it's going to be capital E-G-O for ego. Right? This is going to be the case for reality. When I speak of reality here, and I want to convey reality, or if you allow me, the real reality, the actual reality, or what is it called in the books, pragmatic reality, conscientious reality, that reality would always be with a capital R. And I would just call it reality. However, when I speak of how we perceive reality, what my perception of reality is, I'm going to speak of perceived reality. So not only I will have the R lowercase, but I will also write the word perceived in front of it, because it's the way I see things. It may be that I'm looking at that wall and I think, for instance, if I have some form of aberration in terms of how to distinguish color, I may see that as light blue or light green. Someone may see, no, that's just gray. And then so that's my perceived reality of the color. And we are going to apply that not for colors, not for walls, but we're going to apply that to ourselves. So we said that, but it doesn't end that. We have a few more words, das es, das ich, and das über ich. And yes, the lecture is still in English. Of course, you got it, just with the all right, it's very typical of the Northern European languages. German is one of them. So here's one problem we have. When you read Freud, which is what we're going to use quite a lot today, we have das Es, the it, das Ich, the I, okay, and das Über Ich, the beyond the I. The problem is that when the Trages, James and Alex, they were husband and wife, they translated Freud, they decided to Latinize the German, the English, I'm sorry. So instead of saying the it, they call it id. They use the Latin version, not the pronoun. It was it, as when we say it is raining, give it to the dog, give it to it, right? They also change the I to the ego, or even ego. And they also changed the beyond the I. So the word über there, which means many things, it can be over, ultra, super, as in super ego. But in this case, Freud never intended it to be super ego. Actually, Freud intended it to be what is beyond the I. That is, you have the I, and then we have what is beyond it. So it was supposed to be the beyond the I, and it became the superego. It went even further and became id, ego, and superego. But in reality, we have to say the id, the ego, the superego, unless the grammar of the sentence is in particular asks for us to drop the article. This was a movement in the 18th, 19th century in the English language that was trying to Latinize English, and it caused a lot of problems. Now, the Strachey's have monopoly on the translation about Freudian works because they translated all of them. So they are the most known individuals, and they have the most known translations. But whenever you want to understand Freud, and especially when he decided to create the concept of es, ich, über ich, there is another translation that is considered the most spectacular translation ever done on a work in psychology or even philosophy. Okay, but as I said, wherever we go, whenever we Google anything, because now we don't go to libraries anymore, we just Google them. It's the Strachey's translation that we are going to see. So we have to get used to the id, ego, superego. But remember what they meant: it, I, and beyond the I. So what are they? So here's a picture of an iceberg, just a drawing of an iceberg. And you see there that we have the iceberg here, and just a little bit of it is above the water over here, and the rest is below the water, like a true iceberg. And you see that this iceberg has three divisions. This big one on this side that goes all the way from what's above to what is below. And on this side, there's something here. And then there's another one that is completely submerged all the time. So when we speak of the id, the ego, and the superego, this is where we place them. The id is what is completely submerged. The id responds to what is instinctive in us. So if I'm here and I don't speak, I don't do anything, you cannot realize what my id is. It's not out there for others to see, much like what is below the water. What sinks the Titanic is not showing. Okay? The ego, on the other hand, has a part that is below the water level, and there is also a part that is above the water level. And the superego goes all the way from the submerged part all the way to the top that is visible to everyone. But what are these things? The id is the instinct in us. The ego is the part that relates to I, myself. And the superego is the part that goes beyond me. Remember that? So let me give you an example. Let us say you have roommates. you live in a dorm, or you live in a fraternity house or something. You have roommates, okay? It's you plus another 4 or 5, it doesn't matter. One day you arrive home, okay, and there's a cake cooling off, okay, in the kitchen, on the table in the kitchen. There's no one around. The id is the part that says to you, pig out, eat the cake. Pig out and eat the whole cake. That's the cake. The cake, you've seen it before. It's delicious. You've tasted it before. Just go for it. That's the id. It's the instinct. It's what I want, when I want, the way I want, and I couldn't care less about consequences. The id does not have anything to process consequences. The id is the most primordial in us, the most primitive in us. The ego is the part that says, well, but if I eat the whole cake, I may have a stomach ache. Or then I have to go to the gym instead of just running for 40 minutes. I have to run for 4 hours. It's going to be a lot of time. I'm going to get tired. I have a test tomorrow. Notice that the ego is not saying it's wrong to eat the cake. It is wrong to eat the whole cake. The ego is worried about itself. It's worried about the person. Is the person going to be sick? Is the person going to feel bad? Is the person going to have to go to the gym for longer hours, and so on? That is our ego. What does the superego do? The superego is the one that kicks in and remembers that you're not the only person, the only student in that house, and perhaps the cake just is not yours. So you have no right to touch it. The superego is the part that says, is the cake yours? Why are you going to take a piece of it? Why don't you wait for the person who baked the cake to come in, and so you can ask permission to have a slice? Notice that the id never asked that. The ego never asked that. The ego was actually putting the brakes on the id about eating the whole cake just because it might lead to a stomachache, but not because you are actually taking the cake from somebody else. So that is your superego. That goes beyond the individual and reaches out the community. The community, is, in this case, is all the roommates in the fraternity house. Good? So it's in that sense, it is quite simple. Now, one interesting thing that I have to mention here is we don't have egos. We don't have an ego. We don't have an id. We don't have a superego. Well, we have just been describing all of that, and now you tell me that we don't have it. We don't. This is a model. Freud came up with this model, developed this model to explain, okay, the psychoanalytical part of our personalities. So it is a model, all right? In that sense, it's an abstract construct that we create in order to evaluate something. He took something very big, this, the psychoanalytical mind or personality in this case, and started fragmenting it into smaller problems so he could then look at each and every one of them. So whenever we say, this is why I mentioned before, I cannot say, oh, that person has such a big ego. That word ego is with a lowercase e. Because we don't have egos. We don't have ids. We don't have superegos. That's how we would analyze ourselves according to Freudian concepts. This has to be pretty good for everyone before we can move on. Even these compartments in the iceberg, they are just a model. Freud has been using it, Freud used them, and then other psychologists and psychiatrists have been using them for more than 100 years now. And it's a very good model, but we have to understand it's a model. Now, with the same idea, we can divide the so-called personality or mind into the conscious, the semi-conscious, and the unconscious. There is no such a thing as conscious. It's the conscious, the semi-conscious, and the unconscious. All right? So this is where we have the conscious. Everything that is floating, everything that is above the waterline is the conscious mind. That is the part that we use to interact with one another. I am speaking, you are listening. Okay, later on, one person may doze off, and that all of that is in the conscious aspect. When I choose the words that I want to choose right now, it's my conscious mind. But there is also the semi-conscious mind. The semi-conscious mind somewhat, it sometimes comes up to us from something from the past that is just about to surface. Okay, it's sometimes intuitive, but we should not say, oh, the semi-conscious is intuitive. That's not correct. It's the one that is very close to the waterline, but doesn't cross it into the air. And of course, the unconscious is actually everything that is very deeply buried in the water there, or very deeply submerged, I should say. So all of these things are quite important for us. And in Joanna de Angelis' books, we need to have an idea about these three divisions. The same way that we have to remember the id, the ego, and the superego. All right? So we have that. And again, remember that this is a model. And we are going to focus this talk, on the ego part. Is it because it's more important? No, it's not. It has nothing to do with importance. All three, this is a model. There's no such a thing as one more important than the other. Because if one would be less important than the other two, Freud wouldn't put it there in the first place. We just make it an appendix of one of the other two. All right? So all three are important, equally important. But we are going to focus on the ego because it's a lot to take even with just the ego, trust me. Okay? We should not have a gigantic ego thinking that we can approach everything. All right. So I said that the ego is important because the ego is now the part of the talk I want to focus because of for many reasons. But first of all, because we have a bad way of looking at the ego. Because we confuse the uppercase ego with the lowercase, we always think of the ego as but something bad. Because whenever I say to you, that individual has such a big ego, we are actually trying to put the person down, right? Or we're not saying anything good about that individual. But the ego was actually a very important step in our development. It was the ego that extricated us and made us individuals. What? Okay. Let us now clear our minds. And I'm going to ask you a favor. Don't ask me, is this in human form? Is this before the human form? Is this with the spirit? No, don't go there. Not right now. Just take my word, because otherwise it gets very confusing. Think of ourselves at a point when, if you were an alien looking at a group of us, you wouldn't be able to differentiate one from the other. All right? So the ego is what gives preference to something here or something there or over there, and does not give preference to the rest, that makes us unique. It is in building this uniqueness out of the group that we differentiate ourselves from the rest. So it was our first step towards a personality, because we each have one very distinct personality, and we also have a very distinct individuality. That was the role of the ego. One of the major roles, but we'll see later on with a few animations how this came to be. For now, I'll just ask you to keep that in your minds, that the ego was not so bad, or not the bad guy all the time. It has some very productive, some very important roles for us. So this is what I said at the very beginning in our intellectual path. It was the ego that individualized us. The ego is after the id. It's after we had instincts, we had the ego, but we didn't have the self yet. The self was not developed at that point. So this is also another list of an order of things for us. So once the self comes in, and only then can we start speaking of morality, ethics, courage? Can we speak of love? Can we speak of honesty? Until then, we could not. But we were still progressing. It was a stage in our development. And that stage was reigned over by the ego, was taken over by the ego, but it was important. Without that step, after the instinct, after the id, we would not be here today having this type of conversation. So let us not put the ego with a capital E down. All right? Okay, so we have ascertained the words and everything. So now let me show you something. Now, there are moments in this presentation where you're going to see something very, very faint. I am not trying to check the accuracy of your eyesight, okay? It is to be faint. That's because it's either inexistent or very close to non-existence, okay? But don't worry, because you will see through the animations that as these things become darker and darker, and then you can see them, all right? That means that something is developing, something is progressing, something is evolving. That is what it means. So here, what I'd say is this. At the very beginning, when we're all together in that little pool and another person as an alien would look there and say, how do they know who is who there or what is what, right? That's because we didn't have experiences. You might be saying, what type of experience? It doesn't matter. Experiences. Let us make it very generic. So we had no experiences. This is why this is here on the left side. Very, very faint. So no experiences. No experiences. How can I say what is what? Who is who? Because everybody does exactly the same thing. They don't experience anything different. But then something is going to happen. And we are going to start experiencing different things, which will come in a minute. So as we begin to accumulate experiences, the ego is born. Actually, we should say is developed. It comes into, it makes an appearance. And it's not only that, but the ego is going, which is what you see here on the right side, you're going to see that the ego is going to flourish and it's also going to extend itself. All right? So this is about the experiences that I was telling you before. So this little drawing here, this glooby, it's glooby there, whatever that is. There is no such a word in the English language. It's an experience, whatever that experience is. You notice that the experience is in green. I don't know if you can see that very well, but the color here inside is green, greenish. That means we are green at this point. So I know some people get very upset. I used to be at the Spiritist Center before, and whenever I would say, no, we are not young adults in our spiritual journey. We are actually children barely scraping the adolescent edge or line. And people would say, no, I cannot accept that. Yeah, we are. We are still very, very green. So we are still at a point where we are accumulating experiences in the green state. Now, what we are going to do here is the following. It's an animation. You see the yellow area there, or this ochre color, right? Now, I want you to focus your attention in that area. I want you to look what is going to happen here to the experiences on the left side. And then I want you also to see what is happening to the ego. All right? I haven't started the animation. When I start the animation, the yellow background is going to go away like this. So now just watch, okay? And we can play it again if you miss something. There's nothing. See, as we start accumulating experiences, what is happening to the ego is expanding. The ego develops with more and more experiences that we accumulate. And that's basically what the animation is showing us. Would you like to see it again? Is that okay once? Let's see it again, just quickly. Okay, so there we have it. More experiences, whatever they are. That's why I drew this form that is not a rectangle or a triangle, because I don't want you to start thinking about what type of experience. The point is, as we have more and more experiences, the ego progresses. And we want to ask ourselves now what these experiences are doing to make the ego move forward. So this was the experience the slide we had before at the very end, with a lot of experiences there, and then the ego fully blown in this case, or fully developed, or fully extended. These experiences, they're not only a determinant to the development of the ego, but these experiences are also filters of reality. What is that? Filters of reality? Well, that is a little bit of a problem, but there is a very simple way to look at this. You see the 4 colors there on the lower quadrant on the right side of your screen? We have white, yellow, supposed to be yellow, but sorry. Then we have here green, and this is blue. And you see that I made here a filter, like a filter that you would have in your photo, in your camera. The old days when you could swap the filters. Now everything is digital, but okay. So this is a filter. This is the ego filter, and you see that it's red. Look what happens when I apply it. I change the colors. You see that? Look, it gets into brown, and this is going to get into a purple color. Let's watch it again. Pink and pink, because the background of the slide was already white. That is, different types of brown, and then a purple color. So when we interact with life, when we interact with the creation, the ego, once developed, or even within its development, sees the world as if we were using tinted lenses, changing everything. When you put your sunglasses on and you go outside, things get a little darker. Otherwise, it wouldn't be called sunglasses, right? Because it's supposed to reduce glare, supposed to reduce luminosity, and so on and so forth. The ego is exactly that. It's the equivalent of sunglasses or a filter, a photographic filter, or any monochromatic filter. And each one of the colors that we perceive is what I said before, a perceived reality. A perceived reality. Okay? So the reality is one and the same for everybody. But if now I come in with my ego filter, I see it as my perceived reality. Any one of you comes in, sees that reality, same reality, but you each have a different ego. Each one of you has a different filter. So each one of you is going to create a different perceived reality. So that was it when I said it filters what is out there. So we are looking at the world as if we had this red filtering, which is our ego filter. All right? So how is that possible? You see that observer number 1 on here on your left side? Now, you see that this observer here, when it looks at all of these experiences, what it sees first is these 3, right? Perhaps it even sees that one. But you see that one that I have highlighted? So these are the only experiences that this observer experiences. That's your red filter. Now, let us look at another observer. If you now put a second observer, another one of you, but not the same one. This one is only seeing these 3 here. Only those 3. These are the filters. So even if all of them, or both of them in this case, are seeing the same, have the same experiences there available to them, observer 1 only experiences these 3, and observer 2 only experiences these 3. So they don't have the same impression of the whole set of experiences. Imagine that one of you bakes a cake. Let's go back to the cake. It's not time for dinner, right? One of you bakes a cake, and then I bring the cake, the person brings the cake here. One of you licks the frosting. just the frosting. The other one only takes the dough from the cake. The other one takes what is inside the cake, the filling. The other one only has the candle that was on top of the cake. Nobody knows what the cake really tastes like or even look like if they're just given these things, the frosting, the dough, the filling, and so on and so forth. So we have partial view of the cake, but all of us tasted from the same cake. The same cake, that cake, the original one, is actually reality with a capital R to all of you. But we don't see the whole thing. We only have a piece of it. Not out of malice. We're not talking about malice here, okay? We're not talking about lack of willingness, slacking off. We're not talking about individual being nasty. No, we're just saying we don't have everything. So we are using red-filtered eyes or red-filtered emotions or red-filtered everything. So our perceived reality is a piece of the whole, of the reality with the capital R, but it's not the whole thing. We have to live infinite lives, reincarnate infinite times to be able to approach something that is close to the capital R reality, which is God's creation. That brings an interesting point right away. Discussing about God, we can discuss, but fighting for different models of God or fighting for different approaches to God or constructs of it is just plain silly to be constructive about it, because we all have only a piece of the information. Oh, but we are all spiritists. We all share the same faith. Yes, but we're still using the red tinted or the red filtering eyes or emotions or lifetimes. Our ego is there, not maliciously, but just doing its job, but with only the information that we have, either these three or these three. So we have everything we do, everything we look is a perceived reality. And because it is a perceived reality, now we have a problem. Because we have an instinct of survival that is immense. That instinct of survival, that feeling for survival, that strive for survival is in every ounce, part, section, piece, compartment of our personality, of our individuality. Personality and individuality are slightly different, but right now, for us here, we are going to treat them as one and the same. So what happens is that when something, so as much as grays on our perceived reality and says to us, you are not looking at the whole thing, the ego rebels, the ego revolts, and it doesn't want to relinquish control. Because that is it's an instinct of survival of ourselves. The ego is just a compartment that Freud gave a name to, but that's part of us. By part, I don't mean that we can slice and say this part of me, of Julio, represents. No, the ego is everywhere. It's just a way of looking at it. The part that looks at survival, the part that looks at control, the part that looks at experiences and evaluates the experiences, at least one part. So when the ego feels that this survival is at stake, it comes up with escape mechanisms. In other words, it doesn't want to lose its job. It does not want to lose the limelight. It wants to continue there. So the escape mechanisms are just a form of maintaining those realities that are perceived realities. The ego does not want to incorporate new data because it has more experiences, right? What happens if I have more experience? I expand even further. So my perceived reality changes. Think about every time you read one of these books, you became a better person. Even if you think you're a horrible one, you became less horrible at least. That's why you come here. That is why you read these things. That's why you come and discuss them. Study them. Because deep, 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 deep down, you know that you are improving yourself, even if it's not at the speed you would like to. But you are, and you know that. We all know that. So escape mechanism is when I don't want to let go of what I feel comfortable with. You know, the comfort zone, we call it in English, we say this, the expression is our comfort zone. And that is maintained by the ego. The ego can latch on to that and hold us there and prevent us from moving forward with such a gusto, to such an extent that it can actually drag that perceived reality from one reincarnation to another, and sometimes another, and another, and another. So I may be living today, but I may have ideas from the 17th, 18th century, and I won't let go of them. I will think that the world has to fit to my whims. The world has to obey me, because that's the part of the ego that is very close to the ego with the lowercase e. When I say the world should change on my behalf, on my behalf, sorry. And that's not going to happen. And because it doesn't happen, then what the ego does is basically, it's a very simple thing. Okay, then I will avoid this. Escape mechanism. And there are many types of ways to escape reality with a capital R. By conceiving a perceived reality and clinging on to it as if you were clinging on to dear life. Spiritual, physical, it doesn't matter. Because like I said, it stays here, it's from this physical life, stays here, goes back with us to the spiritual life, because the ego is not material, not physical. It's an abstract concept. So it goes with the essence, our essence. We carry it back to the other world. So this attachment, like I said, can be very intense, can even go throughout multiple lives. And this is what we call, or a great deal, sorry, it's a great deal of what we say atavism. Why is it that we bring things, atavism, which is right here, the last paragraph, last word. It's a significant content of atavism. Why didn't I say it is atavism? Because there are also other things that we bring from our past lives to this one that are also atavic. There are atavisms as well, but they are not necessary that I'm clinging on to something. For instance, I come to this reincarnation and I have I can very, very quickly learn mathematics, but I still have a lot of difficulty with physics and chemistry, for instance. The exact sciences, that's why or the physical science. Why is that? Because most likely I was a very good mathematician, or at least I studied that. So I am basically this time just picking up where I left off. They'll say, oh, but why did you have to go to kindergarten, first grade, primary school, and this is that? Well, because you still have to learn. It's a different, a new physicality, a new physical body. And all of these things are processed at the level, first at the brain level, which is physical. But I learn with at a much faster speed than if I had been seeing this for the first time. So this is an atavic inheritance. This is actually an atavism. Please don't say atavic inheritance, because atavism already means inheritance. So it's like saying real reality, like I did before as a joke, right? So just atavism or an atavic property, things like that. So now we know where the ego came from, where the ego, how the ego got there, how the ego developed, right? And now we're going to see the different types of escape mechanisms. Compensation. Compensation is a big one. And compensation is when the ego doesn't want to deal with something and changes the subject to something else, or tries to debase that same event, that same circumstance, right? Compensation can be quite complex, but I try to break down here in simple items. You have a conflict. The ego has a conflict because its perceived reality can no longer accept new input of experiences, because the new experiences that are coming in are now telling that ego, that perceived reality you had was not a very good one. You have to change your model. You have to change your perceived reality. You have to upgrade it. You have to update it. You cannot use Windows 4 anymore. You have to go to Windows 7, 10, 11, or 8, but you won't be able to go online with the Windows 4. Was it a good system? Yes. When it was put together, it was a beautiful system, but not anymore. So this is it. Now, the ego doesn't want to upgrade. It's being rebellious and will not upgrade. So what does the person do in this case? It starts bashing, putting down all the other operating systems that came after Windows 4 because it wants Windows 4. Or he prefers Mac, Mac 7, one of the Mac operating systems, Leopard or Tiger or whatever, Panther, because it doesn't want to change. So compensation is an attack. It's an attack that is directed at what is different and with a huge amount of rebelliousness, of anger. We see these things a lot in our society, especially these days when we are polarizing. No one is accepting of other opinions. We have our opinions, we want to have our opinions, but we do not want to hear the other side because we are afraid that if we hear the other side, they may actually convince us to move back to the dark side of the force. Or the light one, depending where you are to begin with, right? Not going to be, not playing special, not playing advocate for one or the other. So the whole point here is you have the conflict. The ego cannot solve that conflict. And in order to appease itself, let's put it this way, because the ego is not a person, of course, but we can use these words. The ego retaliates. And we have this primarily with fanaticism, repression, subjugation, prolonged situations of denial. I deny it, and I deny it, and I deny it, and I deny it to the point where one day I don't have any more energy left. And I will say, okay, let me try the other side. Let us see if the lightsaber of the other side is a little more powerful than the one I'm wielding right now. Because I'm tired of using these second grade lightsabers. All right? So that's about it. Or we see also in situations when we have a poor grasp of events. I see something happening. I have a perceived reality of it, but I'm not looking at it with eyes that are more that experience. I could be experiencing those experiences as well, but I don't for one reason or another. So I have a poor grasp of events. And the other one is the limitation in understanding. I see, I have the experience, but I cannot process it. So for instance, you may have someone come over here and give a lecture, a very, very, very top-notch lecture on how to put a satellite in orbit with all the calculus that goes with that. But how many of us here are mathematicians to that level, or physicists or astronomers? So the person may be imbued with the best of intentions, may come here with the best of a PowerPoint presentation and everything, but it will go straight over our heads. We won't be able to understand. So we have a limited understanding of the events, even though it's the same lecture for all of us. And that assuming that we all have the same level of mathematics. When we even consider that, then someone here may understand nothing. The other one is going to go 1 iota over nothing. The other one 2 iotas over nothing. But most of us will go, it will just wash over our heads. Now, examples of compensation are religious fanaticisms in particular. My God is the God. And if you think otherwise, all right? Or events or situations, usually taboos related to sexuality. So a person is sexually repressed, for instance, and the person actually sees everything with a distorted lens. Remember the little red filter of the ego? So the person is repressed sexually. The person who actually wants to do that, but because the person either fears it or does not know how to, anyone doing exactly that is for that person a degenerate, a sexually degenerate, a perverted individual. And we have individuals like that, right? In society, we have individuals, for instance, that lash at everyone. For instance, and this is not about being vegetarian or vegan, but there are individuals that are, they don't just say, oh, I'm vegan, oh, I'm vegetarian, which is fine. It's their choice, and we have to respect that. But they try to put us down if we are not like that. The same thing for any other thing in life. If you are of this political party or that political party, and we're not going to go into politics, but this was what I said to you is a polarization. I think like this. I have this perceived reality, and it's the only one. Everything, my perceived reality is with a capital R. It's not, but I think it is. And I will not hear anybody else's or about anybody else's. So this is it. Then we also have a conformism. What is the conformism? Individuals, either from minorities, or individuals who think they are minority, or individuals who are pushed into a minority, even though they're not minority, and I'll explain to you in a second. They end up doing what the majority thinks, or what some people say it's the standard of behavior, just so they can be accepted and they not have any problems. And one thing that is very easy comes to mind is women. Women have been notoriously conformists throughout the history. And women are exactly in that category that I said. They are thought kind, throughout the progress of humankind, the development, there have always been more women than men. Slightly more. I'm not talking about 10 to 1. I'm talking about 60, 55 to 40 or 55, 45 and so on. But there's always been a little bit more women. And so they are not minorities, but they are thought as minority because control, power has always been in the hands of male individuals. So these are the types of things that we use compensation for. In these cases, the person is using compensation as a matter of survival, different than the other one has a sexual repression or something about his or her religion, and so on and so forth. So these escape mechanisms of conformation, that we conform to something or we compensate to something, okay, are very aggressive, usually very aggressive, irrational, coercive. They try to impose themselves on us, and or the others, I should say, and repressive. The person attacks what the person does not have courage to do for themselves, what the people cannot do for themselves, or what they would like to do and they just fear, or they just don't know how to. It's an attack. And it's very powerful. Let us see another one, shifting or displacement. By the way, I just want to say one thing I just forgot. I don't know if you have a degree in psychology, psychiatry, you may think that these terms are not exactly what you read in the books, and they might not be. I am trying to give you the translation that is the closest as possible to Joana de Angelis' book, because we're here to study Spiritism. Right? So if we call this displacement necessarily, or if some people call it shifting, in the end, it's the same mechanism. And what is it in this case? So in this case, in our lives, spiritual, physical, okay, our conscience, and we're going to have an animation right after this, applies a censorship. Our conscience says, well, this is not very constructive. This is very constructive. Go for it. So you have a green light. So it's a type of censorship. Don't read censorship in a negative way. It's an evaluator, not as someone judging us. to put us away or give us liberty, freedom. It's just someone to say, well, look, there's a cause and effect, or cause and consequence. You do this, that's your consequence. You do that, that's the consequence. Now you choose. But it's a censorship, because it reminds the ego that some behaviors are not going to go the way it has been planned. They have been planned. That's all. This healthy censorship that we have, what happens is that it's there. It's a mechanism that is put on by our conscience to avoid the sense of guilt after something goes on, after something is done. So why is it that I know I cannot just go outside and start screaming? Because this is a place of business. There are other things like that. And I also know that if I do that, someone eventually is going to come out and then complain to me. Look, can you tone it down? Can you speak in a lower voice? This and that. And I'll feel guilty. I'll feel the guilt of having been reprimanded, because I knew beforehand that that would be the consequence. So it's actually a healthy censorship. The problem is that sometimes the censorship grazes on one of those perceived realities of the ego, and that's all it takes. The ego wants to go without any checks and balances. The ego wants to say, I am the king of this area here, and I want to continue with this without being disturbed. That's not the case. And this is when the self begins to develop. It is through this conscience, this sense of this censorship, and this sense of guiltless behavior that gives rise to the self. But we're not going to talk about the self right now. So in this case, what is the displacement, the shifting? It is when we have a disapproval towards people or things, all right? Because they remind us of those perceived realities we don't want to have touched. We don't want to have changed. This is it. These individuals are not the source of our conflict. This is very important, the one that is underlined in red over there. These individuals, or even things, they are not the source of our problems. They're not. But we make them, because we have to throw our displeasure at something or someone. And we know that they are not the source of the conflict. How do we translate this? I have a fight with a girlfriend, with my spouse, or whatever. I go home and I break a lot of glassware. I break a lot of plates. Did the plates do anything to you? Did they insult you? Did they behave in a way you did not agree with? No. But you have to release that frustration that your own conscience is telling you, perhaps you did this, that, and the other, and this is why the person reacted that way, or the person's behavior is the consequence of your initial actions or your words, for instance. Thoughts are a little more difficult, but can even think of thoughts if we are in the spiritual realm. So we lash on the plates, but the plates are not the source of the conflict. But it's a lot easier, right? The plates cannot talk back. So displacement, shifting, retaliation against figures of authority. So people know that they do not do things. They do not follow rules, regulations, statutes. So then any person of authority, even if it's not a person that's never seen, any person of authority is seen with that red filter of bad individual. Stay clear, stay away from individuals like that. We have also non-constructive responses to codes, regulations, like I mentioned before. We also have misconstrued senses of competition, especially in contact sports, when we purposely injure the other person. And so like judo, karate, all right? Most of the martial arts. I'm not saying the martial arts do this. We misbehave And we use the martial arts as our conveyance, as our means to convey that message. So I am upset with something, and now I have judo classes tonight, okay? The person I'm now fighting with or training my martial arts abilities has nothing to do with it. The martial arts has nothing to do with it. But I go there and I do this on purpose. I injured that opponent. And we all suffer from this type of displacement when we try to encourage boxers to fight one another. That is a repressed way of saying I don't agree with a lot of things in society. So we actually have a pleasure that is by proxy in seeing someone knocking the other one out, damaging the physicality. That is a part of us. Again, it's not about boxing. You can have two people fighting, have a boxing fight. What I'm saying is that usually if we are to analyze ourselves, that's what we have behind the scenes here inside. And also, when the boxers go into the ring, onto the ring, usually their trainers would say, go there and do this, that, and the other, think that the person has done this and that. And we see that a lot in sports, especially sports of contact. See your opponent as having done this, that, and the other. When, and only when, we do it like that, we are using a displacement shifting. And we need psychotherapy for that. In the 70s, especially here in this country, in our country, there was a lot of different psychotherapies that were being done by a mom and pop operation in a very bad way, when either you would blame your parents, that's a mixture of displacement with compensation and something else, or you would go into the psychotherapy session and then you would scream at the top of your lungs. Because that was supposed to release the negative energy that you had inside and this and that. Well, yeah, you may release a lot of that, but you do not solve the conflict. It's a palliative. That was also a form of displacement shifting. Let's keep going. 3 more to go. Projection, one of my favorites. So this is an unconscious repression of our personality conflicts. We do not want to deal with them. So in this case, we assign blame. So there is a blame or a fault assignment. I blame something or someone. In this case, I don't break I don't go and break the glassware, the silverware. Sorry, not silverware. I don't bend the silverware. I don't break the dinnerware, because I cannot blame that. Here, I have a focus, not a source, a focus, because the source is always myself. I am supposed to look at my own conflicts. These are conflicts I have created. Nobody else did. Nobody else did. This is an entire lecture about ourselves. It's the most egotistic lecture you can think of, because all we are doing here is talk about ourselves and how we don't want to talk about ourselves when the situation is not in our favor. So here, I not only assign the fault, the blame, I transfer it to that individual or thing, and then I perceive them as the source of my conflict. It's never my conflict to begin with. I am miserable because of them, because of it. So there is no better way to represent this, okay, than what it's not a nomenclature, technical nomenclature, called the Homer Simpson syndrome. So Homer is fat, but just look at what he has on his bed at bedtime. He's fat because things are tasty. See, it's not even saying it's because Marge is a very good cook. He's just saying, I'm fat because things are tasty. So because things are tasty, I have no willpower, no self-control. So as if a food piece of cooked meat or cooked anything could actually tell us, you have no free will. That is projection. He projected his insecurities, he projected his conflict, he projected that conflict between his conscience that is saying, that's too much, you don't need this to survive, and he's projecting it on the tastiness of food, how the food is. Right? His boss is always on his case, always, but he does not realize that he always late, he sleeps in the job, he goes out, he goes to the pub before the workday ends. All of these things, those things he does not touch, because that will make him will force him to reevaluate his perceived reality. So he blames the boss. He has to blame. You have to blame. This is the biggest difference between projection and, let's say, compensation, or even, the displacement. Here we have a target. We blame that target. Introjection is the other way around. In projection, we project ourselves or our miseries, our conflicts onto somebody else. In introjection, we pick those and bring them in. And we have horrible cases of introjection. So we copy behaviors from others. It's very bad. You will see in a moment when I give you the examples, but I think you already have an idea what they can be, all right? So we see something out there, and we copy them, and we start doing exactly what we saw out there. Why? Because we agree. Because whatever we're seeing outside agrees with our perceived realities. As long as they agree with our perceived realities, we embrace them. But the moment one of them would graze at one of our perceived realities, we'll drop them like in a flash, because we don't want them to be bothering us. Copycats, suicides, especially the suicides of famous people. In the US in particular, in other countries, it is actually, there's a law that you cannot advertise the suicide of, rich or famous, like stars and things like that. Especially that, you can say a person committed suicide. Yes, but you don't say how. Because until this law was passed, there was a lot of people that would, every time you had a suicide from a famous individual, you would see copycats on that, and then it would, trail off after that. But for the next 2 to 3 months, you would see a huge spike in the number of suicides in exactly the same manner as that individual, famous star, pop star, had died. So we don't do that. We also have fanaticisms. Say fanaticism is not just for compensation. We also have fanaticisms here, all right? And in the sense that I copy and I don't question. Here, I'm not bashing the other individual who thinks differently than I do. I just come to the Spiritist Center, and everything that people say, I say amen to it. Amen, amen. I leave my brain in neutral. Like I tell my students, don't leave your brains in neutral. It has to be at least first gear. Some even put them in reverse. But that's your fanaticism. Fantasies. This is the one where, especially little kids, they see Spider-Man scaling up the walls of a building, climbing up the walls of a building, and then they end up in the emergency room with a broken leg, broken arm. When it's not broken, other things are even more difficult to fix. It's not just a copycat, because copycat is doing exactly the same thing, the same way, same order, and so on. This is a fantasy. They see that fantasy world, the world of superheroes, and they think that they can take that and put in their own perceived realities. Standardized behavior, also conformism, okay, and uniformity. Also two different ways of interjecting, because I go to a neighborhood where everyone has 2 kids. I think about having 2 kids. Everyone buys this type of car. I buy the same type of car, and so on. At one point where I worked in the past, I had this situation where everyone, with the exception of 2 people, everyone, there was 18 people that had the exact same cellular phone, mobile phone. And whenever one of the 18 would change that mobile phone, the other 17 would, within like a few weeks, they would change it as well. Remember that this doesn't have to be out of malice, okay? If you leave your brain in neutral, like I say, as jokingly, you end up having all of these things. All of us are plagued, myself included. All of us are plagued with escape mechanisms. The ego is still very, very intense in us. Remember, I said we are green. We haven't even got to the adolescent stage of our evolution. So think about it, right? So all of this is, and the idea here when we are studying these things is not for us now to go outside and say, oh, that person is doing, and that's compensation. That other one is, I think it's displacement. Oh, that one is actually rationalization, which is the next one we're going to see. No. If you're doing this, you got nothing out of this lecture. This lecture is about ourselves. I am compensating now, right? Oh, I am rationalizing. I am, because the only way for me to battle my ego is to think like my ego with myself. I can't think about others. You cannot see my perceived reality. You cannot understand my perceived reality. Julio, is the only one, I am the only one who can actually understand my perceived realities. Okay, and we have these reinforcing mechanisms, and this is one of them. And we can also use this to move things from one reincarnation process to another and another. These things are toxic. Escape mechanisms are not very helpful. There are instances, and we're going to leave that for the questions, because we don't have a lot of time to touch on everything, but it is important for us to understand that these are not behaviors we should emulate or continue to have. Last one, promise, it's just 5. And now we have just the animation, and that'll be it. The escape mechanism justification, also known as rationalization. I kind of stay away a little bit from the word rationalization because it also has other meanings. I didn't want to complicate matters. But think of justification. But if you read other articles, you will see also as rationalization. So what is it? In this case, in justification, the ego evaluates the conflict, okay? And then the ego dismisses it with what we call vulgarly or colloquially a lame excuse. It's the famous lame excuse. I give an excuse to myself. Remember, I'm not judging anybody else. I'm judging my own behavior. And I say, well, I did that because I was forced into it. I had no free will at that moment. The person had a gun at my head, figuratively speaking, all right? And all these little things that we say, and how many times we do that. Okay, sometimes we do it on purpose. It's not necessarily always on purpose. Sometimes it can be semi-consciously, right? But for instance, you get late to work, and then the first person that passes by says, oh, my alarm clock did not sound off the alarm this morning. The person didn't even say anything. Perhaps your face looked like the face of someone who had just woken up and got out of bed, but it doesn't matter. The person didn't say, but your guilt made you justify yourself to yourself. All right? That is your rationalization. But that is actually an innocuous, inert one. But we do things in life when we cross a red light in traffic. We don't pay for something on time, but we know that we have to pay. We receive the goods or the services in exchange, and now the person that provided the goods and the service, it deserves to be paid, right? Because if we had swapped places, if we had exchanged places, we wouldn't like to be in debt, to be waiting for someone to pay us. right? We have have our own commitments as well, right? But we say, oh, this has been a very difficult month for me. That may be true, but that does not excuse you of not paying. So we do. And then how deep the excuse is, or how lame it gets, depends on how developed that ego is, or how much it wants to linger or to cling to that perceived reality. Notice the pseudo-rational explanation. That's a beautiful way of saying lame. Lame excuse. I mean, it doesn't cut butter with a hot knife. Okay? That's exactly it. But we call it a pseudo-rational. It's not really rational. Pseudo. It's a fake. That's about it. So this is the worst. This is the most pervasive because it's subtle. Also atavic. We have things that come all the way from reincarnations, 10, 20 reincarnations ago, that we are now manifesting today without even realizing it. And it is also the most democratic of all five, because it attacks anything that moves or stands still, everyone and everything. It is completely indiscriminate. This is why I joke about it being very democratic. It does not pick about, it's not picky about targets. It's moving or it's standing, it's a target. As long as it grazes one of my perceived realities, that is it. So it's one that we have to be very careful about. And it's very subtle, very, very subtle. Things like, oh, I crossed the red light because it was just on the yellow when I began to cross. But you could have stopped. You were not going to be rammed from behind. There was no one. You saw that, but you decided to just give that little push on the gas pedal, right? And we do this all the time. It is very discreet, very subtle. So now we have seen all five. Okay? I'm going to talk about the de-identification process. What is a de-identification process? De-identification is nothing more than putting gently, like Sherlock Holmes once said to Dr. Watson, hold it gingerly, Watson, because it was a box that had a spring with a needle and poison in it. So hold it very, 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 very carefully. Hold it gingerly, Watson. We have to get rid of our perceived realities. De-identify, this is Joanna Giannis' vocabulary. We have to de-identify ourselves from these perceived realities. Substitute these realities by something better, more progressive, more uplifting, and so on. So we have to avoid escape mechanisms, not by simply saying, oh, I have to stop doing it. No, by understanding that our perceived realities are floating points of perspective, and that's it. So as we expand, the ego expands. It expands at the cost of an ever-increasing number of experiences. But there's one interesting thing about this. As the ego gets to a certain point, it gets very hungry, very, very eager to get more experiences. The ego is not actually lazy, and this is the part that I told you, we shouldn't see the ego always at a negative point. And because the ego keeps going after more and more experiences, that it gives birth to something very interesting that we call the self. The inner I, the conscience, the inner I, the inner self, the deep self, the core self, is the one that drives, foments the appearance, emergence of the self to counterbalance the ego. And we'll see in a minute how this goes. The ego, most of the time, tries to shackle us down to our atavic experiences, to what we experienced before, but in the same way it does that, because it also has this, let's say, feeling of self-importance, it ends up accumulating more experiences, which end up being its own doom. You know, it's like when someone wants to conquer land, and conquers and conquers and conquers. And eventually the person conquers so much. This will remind you of the Roman Empire. Conquered and conquered and conquered and conquered. Got to a point when they would say the sun rises and sets in the Roman Empire. But then it was so big. They didn't have enough people to keep the order. What happened? Lost it to the barbarians. And this is the history of humankind. Every empire out there grew and grew and grew, got hungry, very, very hungry, very, very eager, and eventually did not have the means to support, to maintain it. Lost everything. So this is the same thing with the ego here. And we are going to see now about the self. And it's just an animation. So birth of the self, and once the self emerges, it starts to compete with the ego for attention, let's say. So remember the experiences, and then a lot of experiences gave us the ego, which you see there with the bar fully red, okay, fully filled. All right. Now, from this point, what we are going to do is the following. Watch what happens to these experiences. I'm going to couple, or I'm going to group a lot of these experiences into something called an experience set. And instead of speaking of experiences, I'm going to start speaking of experience sets. Each set can have 1,000,000, 1,000, 10, 20, it doesn't matter. But it's a set, no longer one. So now each one of these symbols that I drew, this glooby, the one there on the left upper corner of your screen, is now going to be, or it will become as an experience set. And in order to show that to you, I will change its color. Okay? An experience set is all of those that are green over here in one. And you see that it is what? It's a little difficult there, but it's like red to orange to kind of yellowish. I was thinking of mangoes when I did this. I wouldn't eat a green mango for the life of me. But, you know, they get to a point where they are yellow, and depending on the type of mango, they are red, they are, you know, orange, or they are even, you know, kind of pink. So when everything here gets collapsed into one, so now each one of these red gloobies that you have there is going to be an experience set. And there you have it. Experience set through our conscious creates, or actually creates knowledge, because actually it picks up information, and that information is then converted, transformed into knowledge. That knowledge then leads us to behave in a certain way. It creates a code of behavior. And that code of behavior is what eventually is going to expand based on multiple experience sets. The same way that we had with the experiences before, leading the ego to expand, now we're going to have the expansion of the code of behavior based on experience sets. Remember, each one of these symbols now is a multitude of other symbols inside. So here's our ego, fully grown, fully developed. The ego keeps asking for more information that will be eventually, by the conscience, be transformed into knowledge. And that then begins to create inner conflicts. Because this new knowledge that's coming in is now not matching those perceived realities put forward by the ego. So the more the ego wants, the more difficult it is for it to manage the data that's coming in, or that are coming in, the experience sets that are coming in. Because now more knowledge means that certain things through the conscience and through this code of behavior will be telling the ego, this is not constructive, that is constructive. So it creates inner conflicts, perceived reality being in shock with the reality with capital R. And there is where the self emerges. So the self can be said in loose terms to be born out of the egotistic behavior of the ego. Let's put it this way. The ego wants more, the ego wants more and more, but the more it gets, the more conflicting it becomes. So now let us see what happens when this works, and this is the animation. You have the ego self conflicts. Let us start with one experience set. Fully blown ego, or fully developed, I should say. So you don't think of fully blown as, an egotistic person necessarily. I want you to focus your attention again in this yellowish area. All right? Just watch what is trying to happen, what is happening there. So remember that I create inner conflicts. As we have more and more data, the self begins to reassert itself. It emerged, but it's very, very naive in comparison to the ego. The ego is primordial in comparison to the self. So if you watch there's a little tug of war. The ego yields a little bit, then the self goes up, but then the ego takes it back, and it keeps going like that over and over and over and over again. All right? In the animation out there. So how is it possible for us to solve this conundrum? The self wants to improve. Joana de Angelis says to us, you have to look at yourself, self with a capital S in this case. You have to feed it. You have to look after it. So what do? We feed this. We feed ourselves with more experience sets, which is a very elegant way of saying, live your lives. No, it's not even that. It's live your lives. Do not be afraid, because if you are afraid, you don't collect more information and you stay there. You won't move up, but you also won't move down. But you still won't move at all. You won't budge. So now when the experience set improves or increases, I want you to look, that's the last one. Last animation. I want you to look at all of that and see what happens when the experience set or sets increase. So you start with perceived realities and even conflicts, inner conflicts. And the self is very, very young, very, very immature, not very developed. But look, as we start adding more and more experience sets, the self also begins to develop a little bit more. And as it develops more and more, you notice that something is appearing on your screen that is in green at the very bottom of the middle portion, right here. So these are the things that come to us that are the result of a developed self. We are de-identifying ourselves from those perceived realities of the ego. The red color is related to the ego. The green color is related to the self. So as the self begin to develop more and more, see, now it's almost 50%, up 50%. Now we have half ego, half self. This is, of course, is just to give you an idea, all right? It's an animation, it's not that quantitative. I want you to convey that. But this is the struggle that Joana de Angelis is telling us. And notice that I didn't go 0 to 100. And across, what was 100 became 0, what was 0 became 100. They go in this tug of war gently, gently, gently. And eventually, the self will win, because we will be applying all the experiences that we have suffered. Suffered is not a very good word because it may lead to negative, but we have experienced, basically. And we have lived. And eventually, we'll reach a self that is quite well developed. The ego has not gone backwards in evolution, okay? It's just that the self took over. The self developed more, but this is easier to show here, just for our representation. The ego never goes away. We don't dispose of the ego. The ego is like the id. The id was the instinct. We will always have the instinct in us. Even the high order spirits that are now in the angelical states have ids. They just don't work or use it in their behavior. So the same thing is for the ego on a person with a very well developed self. And this is what Joanna de Angelis is telling us. And the message here is that you cannot go to the ego and chop it off like you were like a rotten tree, a tree that is dead already. No, you have to de-identify yourselves from those perceived realities gingerly, slowly, gradually, because if you do, if you pull yourself from the situation of all your perceived realities, you lose your roots. You have to de-identify yourselves. We have to do that, but not abruptly. And that is the message. Okay, perceived realities and spiritual growth. And before you throw a rotten tomato in my face, we will use this with your questions to discuss. Because I knew it was going to be a little longer. I even asked Daniel for 10 more minutes. Actually, I got 7. Oh, good. Not as bad. Okay. But before we go to your questions, let me just say thank you very much for the invitation, the opportunity to be here, for the questions that you're going to have, your attendance and everything. Thank you.
I'm speechless trying to use this
Okay, now.
to myself, not to others. Julio, thank you. Thank you for this amazing explanation. And I do have questions. But before that, I would like to open for the public and open for those online as well. Daniel mentioned to me that we have 2 questions that we will try to interpolate here between here and the web. Comments, questions. Quite a bit, right? It's okay.
So I just
Daniel.
moved the system to the so that people that are watching from home can also participate. And now Daniel has the control of it.
Thank you, Leo. Oh, thank you, Leo, and thank you, Julio, for this beautiful presentation. So we are more complex that way, supposed to, right?
Oh, yes.
So
We
you
should
just
give
present
ourselves
5,
some credit,
right? 5
you know?
escapes. I was wondering how many escapes we have, right?
Oh, yeah, by the way, they're
Yeah.
not just 5. These
Exactly.
are the 5 that Joanna de Angelis thought it was important to
about.
put on a book.
Yes. So I guess you answer my question, but I'm gonna throw back to you, because as you're presenting those escapes, the first thing that came to my mind was of these 5 that you have presented is the most detrimental for our evolution, for someone evolution, right? Our evolution, right? But then at the end, you mentioned that rationalization is one of the most detrimental, is most like, and why is that? Is because I know you mentioned that is democratically, but it's because we have utilized that escape for since we are identifying ourselves as a human being. So why you think rationalization would be the most, I would say, detrimental for our evolution?
So escape mechanisms are both equally good and both equally bad. The reason I gave special attention to rationalization, justification, is also because Ronald Janges mentions it. So that is not my opinion. You have someone with of weight saying these things. And I'm not rationalizing, but it's the truth. Okay, but it's because it's the one we apply the most in our lives. We use the most. You know, you can't just. I mean, we don't have enough money to break the dinnerware every single day for every little injury or offense or insult we get, right? But finding a lame excuse, oh, we are top experts on that one. All of us. Okay.
So technically, we can call it an generalization. that is the most important one. Thank you, Daniel. You want to pose the question? He reads it, or do you have it in front of you?
I don't see anything, but I can read if it's there. So that gets.
No,
Oh, you can say it, Daniel.
right here.
Oh,
Seriously.
great. All right. Oh, this is from. Do you want me to identify people? Is it okay? Okay. This is from Kirsten Santos. Julio's old displacement bad. all types of escape mechanisms called displacement bad. Example, when a mother who is able to love someone else's child, or who can see all other kids as if they were their own child, is that a form of displacement? Love is never displacement. Displacement usually means a very negative feeling, all right? So in this case, no, love is never an escape mechanism. Perhaps in this case, I don't know if the idea here um, is like in terms of comparison of someone's own kids versus somebody else's kids. But these are preferences. These are atavic inheritance. These are atavic traits that we have from other lives. Perhaps the somebody else's kid had been a kid of ours in a past life. So I don't know if it's in terms of a comparison. Comparisons are, in this case, are usually not a very good thing, and it indicates kind of a pseudo love. But if it's outside of comparison purposes, no, you can love, you can adopt someone and love that individual more than anything else in your life, like he had been your own kid, your biological child.
Wouldn't also that be in a way depending on the situation, because it's hard for us to pinpoint what it is, right?
Right, yeah.
Because of but also a development of the self. Once the ego starts seeing just my kids as my kids, but also someone else as that I would treat as if it was my kids, right?
Yeah, no, it's a step forward, because the ego is one of the reasons why, for instance, in adoptions, first of all, they don't want to adopt. They cannot have their own kids, and they struggle and they struggle, and they are miserable. And I'm not saying they're bad people. I'm just saying they're feeling a great deal of misery, but they cannot come to terms with themselves. You remember the conscience and the inner conflict to adopt someone, because they are still biologically driven. It has to be my DNA. That's what is behind the whole thing. Or they do adopt, but in the adoption they want this, that, the other. So it feels like a supermarket when we go and want to buy tomato soup, and I want this type of tomato, this from this company, from that thing. I want it to be organic, and that as opposed to I want a child. So when we get to a point of someone adopting, I just want a child. I want someone to love, to raise. And that is a development of the self, okay? That is the physical impediment to become pregnant or to have their own kids, which is a couple, right? The physical impediment is physical. It has nothing to do with the escape mechanisms of the ego. But the adoption is definitely a plus for the self. Yeah, true love is always a plus, never.
Thank you, Julio. Anyone else here before?
A good point.
We can go ahead and move on to the next one then, and then I'll ask a question.
Okay, so this is from Paul Schmidt. How does Spiritism view the superego? The superego, remember, the superego is Freudian nomenclature, all right? And other psychoanalytical constructs also use the idea of the superego, but we give Freudian the idea that, or the title that he came up with the model. So Spiritism kind of matches the self with the superego, but it's not really the self. And the reason is the following. Do you remember when I showed you the iceberg picture? And you had the superego going all the way from the top above the water, then just below the waterline, and then all the way down, deep down. And remember that an iceberg is at least 80 to 90% underwater. So when you see an iceberg, it's nothing compared to, or very close to nothing compared to what is under the water. So the superego takes all these three parts. And if it were just, the self would be a lot related to that idea of the superego, the deep superego, the one that goes all the way deep into the water, because this is the one that is going to be related to our atavisms. In this case, the good ones, the good things that we bring from our past lives. Okay? As it goes closer and closer to the water, perhaps we would say this is a bit of a mixture of the concept of the ego, when the ego is actually helping us to identify or to create an individuality or a personality. So then the self, very close to the superego, yes. But not, one is not a synonym from the other. But definitely the self would not be the ego or associated with the ego, and the self would not be associated with the id. The id is really instinctive, really primordial to the, to the extreme.
Very well.
Thank you
Julio,
for the
question that I have is that I think you nailed it right in terms of us using this for ourselves, right? But I cannot stay away from the idea that as I develop myself, right, as the ego lessens and to a certain degree, and the self takes over, that this is also happening collectively,
Yes.
right? So in this conflict that is happening within the oneself now in terms of like I, right, is, would you also say that this is a representation, or what's happening nowadays in our society is this explains what is happening in our society, this conflict, or not only the of one person or a group of individuals, but also collectively, that these conflicts are happening and created this whole chaos, right? Sometimes we see one another clashing, and it's in even the on how we the escape mechanism involves us, and the perceptions are happening to all of us as well. So I kept thinking in terms of the collectiveness of this whole thing.
Yes. So when you move from the individual, which is already very complex, like Daniel just said at the very beginning when we started the question, that I didn't know we were that complex, right? Or I'm surprised that we are even that more complex than I originally thought. So now imagine when you start, even if you consider just this group, what, 10, 15 people, and we are not linear. Just because there are 10, let's say 10 people, we just multiply everything by 10. Because they are synergistic, they're antagonistic, there are so many different ways we interact with one another that the group, the whole, is much more complex than just the simple addition or even subtraction of our traits and personalities or individualities. So by the time we get to a society, it gets really, really bad, really, really complex, convoluted, I would say. That's the word. It's not bad convolution. It's just convoluted. That's all. It's convoluted because all these traits, they mingle, they match, they act on one another, and this is why I always say we evolve individually, but we learn collectively, socially. So this is how we also experience other things, other sets of experiences, by being together. If I were to pinch one of you here and, let's say, put you in an island where you would be able to live as long as possible with all the comforts, but you would never, ever, no cell phones, by the way, interact with anyone. You wouldn't have the book, okay? You could have the knowledge, but you wouldn't even have the latest books. You would have knowledge of certain things that would be available to you. Then our progress would not stagnate, because we are the ones who put the effort to move ourselves forward, but it would definitely slow down considerably. We need one another. We must have one another. This is not about opinions. It's a fact. We are not snakes, by the way.
We're not what?
We're not snakes, because when the egg eclodes and the baby snake comes out, the first thing it does, it goes predatory. It knows how to hunt and how to get it. We don't. We don't. With all that we say, oh, but in other lives, in the spiritual realm, of course, I was born, I was raised, I was educated, and this and that. I'm not talking about degrees, but in terms of instructed. So where is all that? The physicality does not know how to do that. We still need to be in society to redevelop some skills. Skills that are now more compatible with this new physicality that we have. Because each new physicality, even though it takes like 40, 50,000 years for us to have differences in our physicality, in our physical bodies, it's still a different body. Okay, Kirsten Santos has another one. People who do abruptly move away from the ego, do they normally enter into a psychosis or mental illness such as schizophrenia? I am not competent to say that it's a psychosis or a mental illness, in particular schizophrenia, but it is a clash. And according to Joanna, it is a very, very negative procedure when we try to just cut it short. Oh, I'm not going to have a perceived reality anymore. Think about it this way. How do you de-identify yourself from a perceived reality? By getting more data, right? By not getting more information, but by converting that into knowledge and then using that knowledge to create the code of behavior or to alter the code of behavior. You following me? But now, if you decide to cut everything, isn't that escape mechanism as well? Because how can you do that? How can you de-identify yourselves? How can we de-identify ourselves just because I wished for it? I don't have the data to do it, and no amount of data. It would require us to know the creation like that, to experience everything like that. It's not a Hollywood movie. Everything has to happen within 1 or 2 hours, whatever. And then they squeeze everything those last 5 minutes, and everything that was bad gets converted. So no, it takes time. We have to interact. This is why I said, and definitely Jean recommends, live your lives, experience more, process more, but be open to what you experience. Because if you try to remove at once, it is going to be very detrimental. Joanna Jones is actually in the conscientious being. She actually says that these individuals will require a long time of psychotherapy if they try to do so, or if they are subjected to repression. Let's say I have a partner, a spouse, or I have kids. If I force them to de-identify themselves at my will, within my whims or my way, I will actually cause them more harm than if I had let them stay with their identified, perceived realities.
Julie, on that note, sorry, were you done?
Okay. No.
Would it be prudent to say that if we willingly, as we are experiencing things, as we are having the experience in sets, right? And now with this understanding, we start to also try to understand the experiences of others. That perhaps my reality is a completely different reality for that individual. I'm not asking to conform with those realities, but at least to be able to say, okay, this is what I perceived. Their perception is completely different. Much like our perception of your talk today was different for each one of us, right? But would that help in essence to develop the self more rapidly or safer?
There is no more or less rapid or faster or more slowly or to make it a more substantial change in the self, because you see, this is something that is an all or none. You either develop it or you don't. There is no halfway. But the halfway here is how much you have developed. So it's not that we measure the self saying this is 1 iota of self, this is 2, 3, these are 2, 3, 4, 5, and this is 100. You can only do that when you know what is the maximum. Like when I say to you guys, do you know when your car has half a tank of gas? You only know because you know what a full tank is. Even if you have never put enough to get the tank full, you can open the manual and say it's this number of liters or gallons, right? So if you have half of that number, you know it's half full or half empty if you're of a positive or a negative mood. But we don't know what is the maximum for self. We are always progressing. We don't know where the end is. So what I can say is that today I'm better than yesterday. Today I'm better than 100 years ago or 2 reincarnations ago. So this is it. And we progress at our speed. We cannot force anyone to progress the way we want. Because like I said before, we progress, we evolve individually.
So, in other words, it's not the number of experiences, but how we perceive them. Because one can have a million experiences and not necessarily not learn from it.
Yeah, like remember the 2 observers that I put there, and I used the location so that they couldn't see the other things that were behind the position that they were. Well, okay, that is a physical analogy, of course, because we don't. It's difficult to put in a picture something that's so abstract. But I think it serves like when people say, for instance, when you are in a forest, all you need is a branch to completely block your vision, right? To block your field of vision. But then if you go to a slight hill, or a mountain, you can see the whole valley because you're above the trees. So it's like that. It depends where you are. But this position of being next, right next to the forest or at the top of a hill is our willingness to collect more information and process it. Willingness. Even if it doesn't do us immediate good, it's the willingness of bringing information in and processing it. It's important for us to understand one thing. This is not for us, all this we discuss here, for us to, the Freudian model is this, that, and the other. Now I know this, now I know that. No. It's just to be aware that we have a tendency to escape ourselves. Ourselves. This is not to measure anybody else. Our kids, our spouses, our bosses, or our employees. No. It's to measure ourselves because we are the only ones who know the true way that our conscience work. Remember that big arrow that I had there with the conscience written at the top, creating the code of behavior from the knowledge? That is our conscience, nobody else's. It's not even the cosmic conscience. God is aware of what we are thinking, but it's not doing anything for us. We have to do our own homework. So we do it in such a way, and we get to certain points according to how much effort we put in, like a student with a homework, and according to how willing we are, not just to do it, but because some people do things mechanically. When we do things mechanically, we just perpetuate. We just perpetuate the perceived realities, and we use rationalization to fool us into believing that we are actually doing our homework. That's the student who does all the homework by looking at the answers at the back of the book. It is equivalent. Or, does all the homework by copying it from somebody else.
Thank you. Last question.
Oh, please.
Julio, because the society is a little complicated nowadays, I see a lot of people that their tendency is getting stuck in their houses, and they don't want to interact with the neighbors or anything. It has nothing to do with the neighbors. They just go to work, go to their church, come back, and barely say hi or good morning or something to their neighbors. And also people who they say, oh, I want to live off grid, and they go live in the middle of the woods. They don't want to be in society because they said it's too much to comply, taxes and the renting and the cost of living, and they try to live off grid in their
Mhm.
way to say. Um, so is that a kind of slowing down their progress, or, switching from ego to, self?
So, okay, thank you. Um, in the book Empty Lives by Joanna de Angelis, chapter 4, she asks that question. Why is it that today we're almost living on top of one another? There's so many people, and yet we are isolating more and more. We are lonely. We're not alone. We're lonely because being alone is important. Sometimes, actually, Joanna de Angelis asks us, and Emmanuel tells us, you have to have moments to yourself, so you can look inside of yourself in the silence of your mind. Remember that God cultivates the garden of our plenitude in the silence of our minds. So if you're never there, there's no reason for it to cultivate the garden for us. Okay? This metaphorically. Now back to the question. So we are isolating ourselves more and more. This isolationism comes from so many different ways. I mean, you said it yourself, it's very complex. So I'm going to give you one of the many aspects. Fear. Fear. Absolute fear. Almost to the point of, actually, it is, when they isolate themselves like that, okay, they are actually panicking. It's a fear that has become pathological. Now, be careful with this, okay? Just because someone lives further away from others does not mean necessarily that they are isolating themselves. There are people who do that, but whenever there's a gathering, they're the first ones to say, well, when can I come? What should I bring? They live with people. They interact, especially now with technology. We can interact with people on the other side of the globe without ever meeting them physically, face to face. So what I'm saying is about those individuals that sequester themselves away from everything, from society in general. And this is also a rebelliousness, because we do not want to, we want to say, I have free will. Nobody has free will. Okay, I have free will. That's what they tell themselves. That's the rationalization. I have free will, but in society I cannot express it, because if I am in society to express it, I would be able to say I don't want to pay taxes, or I don't want to pay rent, or I want to play loud music at 2 a.m. even though I live in a building, with apartments in front, on the sides, and above and below. So living in society imposes restrictions, but these very restrictions, I'm not talking about negative ones, are there to educate us, because it allows us to think of the other. If we don't do it on our own, because at least there is a law that says, look, you cannot make that amount of noise after this number, after a certain time in the evening, and until a certain time in the morning. So these restrictions, they are constructive in a way. They are. When a teacher sets the test for the students, same thing. How would the students know that they have been preparing themselves well if they have never been tested, if they are never tested, right? And then this is with anything in life. Even the mistakes we make, the mistakes are the worst types of restrictions that we have. The mistakes teach us, as long as I don't use any of the escape mechanisms of the ego to either justify, to either compensate, to either assign blame to someone or something. No, okay, I made the mistake. Why did I make that mistake? What was behind it? Was I tired? But why was I tired? Because I went partying the night before I had a surgery, or I went to a party the night before a big test. So these are the things that make us look back inside. So they are useful. They're very useful. But if I now rebel against them, like in some of the concepts that we just studied today, we saw today, then I'm just escaping, missing the opportunities for growth that I've been given. Living in society is, in essence, having more opportunities to grow. When we isolate ourselves, we slow down our growth. And again, be careful with slow down. It's in the sense that I am not growing as much as I could had I been living in society. It's not about I'm not growing as much as my neighbor or as much as my siblings. It's not about comparing yourself to somebody else, but it's yourself to what you could be doing. You know. But yes, it's fear in one case, it's rebelliousness, it's that thing, I have a perceived reality of things. And if it's not the way I want, then it's wrong. And these are very extreme, but then the consequences are also very extreme. Remember when I said just now, we don't have free will. I mean, I know that in our language, not English, human language, we say, I have honesty, I have ethics, especially ethics, right? We should say, I am an ethical being. I am an honest being. That's what we should say. Because ethics, morals, honesty, love, these are not properties. They are attributes of the essence. Because they are attributes, we are them. We do not have them. Also because the essence cannot have anything because it's not material or physical. So we are them. And this is another interesting thing that comes from your question. Imagine that I were to ask, and someone would say, oh, I am this honest, from the floor up to here. But, when it comes to ethics, I am, let's say, halfway. But when it comes to love my neighbor, love the others, it's all the way to the roof. The person is not saying that he or she is in the angelical state. Just saying that you see that these variations, nope. You are this ethical, you are this loving, you are this honest, you are this amount of free will develop, or you have it developed this amount, because they are all one and the same. You cannot love more than you are ethical. In the same way, you cannot love less than you are respectful. So all of these attributes, they grow evenly. Other things, aptitudes, like playing the violin, you may be a disaster in the piano or the flute or the guitar, but you play the violin like a virtuoso. So the attributes that we have in each reincarnation process, those we have, and they can be in different levels, at different levels, but not love, universal love, not ethics, not moral, not respect, or honesty. These we don't have. We are these things because they are not properties. They are attributes.
Thank you, Julio. I would like to, first of all, give thanks to all of those who followed us online as well. And I would like to, I said that was last question, but we have another one that we will close with that, and then we'll finalize our...
When I collapse, it's the end.
Look, it's not, you did it so well that, people want to hear more. So
No, I'm fine.
I know.
Just joking.
It's actually on the screen right now.
Okay,
So if you can
so
read it.
what can we learn? Preliminary. What can we learn as humans that cannot be learned in our true form, in our spiritual bodies, in the spiritual world? So what can we learn as humans that cannot be... Oh, okay. So I understand. Could you go back, please? Thank you. So what can we learn as humans that we cannot learn as spirits, basically, right? So that when we are just with a spiritual body, our perispirit, loosely speaking. So in order for us to run the marathon, we need, first of all, to have legs if we want to run the marathon. That's not split hairs. Yes, oh, but if I don't have legs, I can go with a wheelchair. Yeah, okay, but don't sass me. Okay? In order for me to run the marathon, I have to have legs. But having legs, I've never run the marathon. I do have legs, and they work. I'm standing right now because I have them, right? But I also need to know how to walk and then run. I cannot run if I don't know how to walk. I cannot walk if I don't know how to crawl. I cannot crawl if I don't know how to walk on all fours. There are steps for me to get there. It's the same thing. For us to be able to learn things, we have to go through the most dense or the most, I'll say, simplest things. And the simplest things in life we learn here, all of us. No one has that no one is an exception. The physicality is the densest, crudest form of matter. We have to start here in order for us to reach a point when we can learn only in the spiritual realm. All right? Without that, it's all rhetorical. It's just talking about it. It's philosophical, but it's not pragmatic. It doesn't happen in real life. For a brilliant to be set on a ring, that brilliant had to be a diamond first. That's the original stone. That diamond had to be lapidated to become a brilliant. We usually just say diamond, but brilliant is the last one. That brilliant had to be a diamond before, and that diamond had to be carbon pressurized at gigantic pressures, way millions and millions and millions of years ago, and at very, very high temperatures. That is the physical chemistry of the birth of a future brilliant. If you were to go there, and if you'd look at that piece of carbon, charcoal, folks, that piece of charcoal that you have in your grill or you have in your barbecue pit, okay? If you were to look at that and say, this one day, because of the convolutions of a globe, will put enough, those convolutions will put enough pressure and heat, and it will compress that into a diamond, and then someone will pick that diamond, mine it out of the ore, and then lapidate it and polish it, and then it's going to be this beautiful gem that sparkles with the slightest amount of light. You wouldn't say, no way. We are that charcoal. We have to learn here in the physicality, in the physical world, the very first things, we have to be subjected to those immense amount of those huge pressures and huge temperature gradients, so that we can one day hope to be a diamond, and then have someone come in, take us, extract us, mine us out of the earth, lapidate us, polish us, that we can sparkle as beautifully as a diamond as the high order spirits. It's stages.
Beautiful answer and beautiful talk. So thank you very much for all of this.
Oh, thank you. The questions
All-
were amazing. Very good.
Thank you.
Very
All
good.
that we can ask is
Appreciate
to bear with us as we try to put this into practice, right? As Julio said several times here, is for
Slowly.
us. You could? Yes,
Slowly.
please. Slowly,
do-
yes. Let's not
we
do it fast. In practice with one another, challenging one another too. What I would say is to connect with these thoughts, right? When we were going through the difficulties of life, right? The crisis. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with those crises. Those difficult moments in our life. So it's definitely. You want to say something else?
I just want to say something funny. Oh, no. I still have
Sure,
the microphone here. When I read Sherlock Holmes, I was like 12, and I read in English. I read that gingerly, right? And then I had to look it up, because at that point I didn't know much English, so I had to look at almost everything, but that one in particular. And I said, one day I will have a use for this word, because even the dictionary said nobody uses this anymore. Now you know. Everything that we do in spiritual life here while we are in the physical world, and later on, slow steps, slow increments, gingerly.
Gingerly. Gingerly. I did not know that was
It's a funny word.
that was
you
from
know.
Sherlock Holmes, but
No, it's not. No, it's from English. But
yes, I get it. But that struck you from that passage there.
if you
so-
were to say something like, "Oh, do this gingerly today," people would look at you and say, "What?
Yes, what?
Did you spend the night with a dictionary?" Things like that.
Or are you trying to
Or to
improve
depress.
your exactly? But thank you for your explanations here tonight. I mean, definitely it will help us and help others as well as we put into practice, right? Because of time and in lieu of our passes, I would like to ask Diony for our final prayer. Yes, please. And we can bid ourselves goodbye as well. And we will be serving the water as well. But don't go yet, because we do have another activity tonight. So hang in there. I know it's late, but please, please, please stay with us.